So it's no secret that I use Sony cameras a lot here on the channel. I have the Sony FX3 as well as the Sony A7IV. So I've been getting a lot of questions lately asking if it's worth investing in either one of these cameras. Well, the short answer is yes and no. But let me explain. There are a few key factors that come into play when you're thinking about investing in a new camera system. I've personally used the A7IV for about 8 months and the FX3 for almost 2 years. So I just thought I would give you my thoughts and personal opinions based on the experience that I have with both of these cameras. But first, before I get into all of that, what's happening, everyone? My name is Ryan. If you're new with us here on the channel, welcome. I truly appreciate you being here. All right, so let's get into it. Okay, so just a couple of things right off the bat. Number one is we're not sponsored by Sony. And also too, we're not gonna go into a technical review here on either of these cameras. I do have a more in-depth kind of review on the A7IV. If you'd like to check that out, I'll leave a link in the description below. This is just gonna be more of my opinion and experience with both of these cameras, using them professionally to kind of hopefully help you make a decision on either of these cameras. But with that said, let's get into our first thing, and that is the key differences. Number one is overheating. Now, I know there are a lot of people talking about the overheating issue on the A7IV. We're gonna get into that in a second, but the Sony FX3 itself, like most cinema cameras, has a fan in it, so it's less likely to overheat. The Sony A7IV doesn't, and has been known to have an overheating problem, and will usually shut down if it does. But there is a way to bypass that, so really it's not that huge of a deal. I talk a little bit about this in another video, so if you're interested in learning how to bypass that in the menu system, I'll leave a link in the description below. But with all of that said, when filming longer recording times, like for a documentary interview or a podcast, for example, it's really nice to know that your camera's not gonna overheat and shut down in the middle of recording. Now, the second thing to consider is audio. The Sony FX3 not only comes with a top handle, but it also has 2 XLR inputs on that top handle, giving us professional audio right into the camera. Now, not only does it have the 2 XLR inputs, but it also has, in addition to that, the 1/8" jack for, say, something like a Rode VideoMic Pro or something like that. The Sony A7IV only has the 1 audio input. However, this could be more than enough if you're a vlogger or a run and gun filmmaker, like on a documentary, for example, or even filming documentary interviews or corporate videos. This could work really great. As a matter of fact, I've recorded many videos just with my VideoMic Pro. All I did was buy an extension for the input jack that I had on my camera over to my Rode VideoMic Pro, and it worked out great. You could also buy external audio devices like wireless lav systems, field recorders, and shotgun mics, kind of like what I'm using here in this talking head. There are many different ways to remedy your audio situation and get a high quality sound for your films at a much less price than, say, buying the Sony FX3. However, if you're looking to upgrade from, let's say, the Sony A7IV, having this top handle is really handy, and it also makes things a lot easier in post because you're not syncing your audio with your video. So there's that to consider. But really, it just depends on the kind of work that you're doing. With TV commercials, for example, unless you're doing a commercial with a lot of dialogue, audio really isn't the main concern for me. I'm usually just focused on the visuals, and I will do a lot of sound design in post. But with a documentary film, I really just want to get the best audio that I can get. And if I'm doing a run and gun style shoot, I'm usually going to have my shotgun mic on my Sony FX3 handle going into the camera. With that professional grade quality, you're really getting great ambient sounds for your film. I might also do that for a podcast because there are 2 input jacks. You can do 2 people at a time and get great audio that's going straight into your camera. And the third difference I will say is the image quality. Now, both of these cameras have very good image quality, and if you were to choose any one of these, you could do all the work that I'm talking about in this video. Documentaries, TV commercials, even narrative films. I've seen plenty of films done on the Sony A7IV and even less expensive cameras than that. Another key difference for me is the low light features, and more specifically the native ISO. Now, if you're wondering what native ISO is, in a nutshell, it is the ISO settings where your image is gonna look its best. Now, the good news is that both of these cameras have dual native ISO. For the Sony A7IV, it's gonna be 800 and 3200, which is really great for what this camera is, and for S-Log3 422 10-bit, this is amazing. However, on the other side, for the Sony FX3, it's gonna be 800 and 12,800, which is insane. I can actually see better on the camera than I can with my own eyes at night, which is crazy. Here are a couple of images of each so that you can kind of get a good idea of what both of these look like. Now, one isn't better than the other. If 3200 is going to be absolutely 100% enough for any scene, as long as you know what you're doing and you know how to light that scene. But with the FX3, you just have that extra boost, and you can do things even without lights sometimes on a day just like this. This is the end of the day. I believe it's around 7:30 or 8 o'clock, pretty late, so it's doing a really good job. But anyway, either way, both of these cameras are gonna do really great with low light. The FX3, however, is just gonna give you a little extra boost. That Sony FX3 can do 120 frames per second at 4K versus the Sony A7IV that does 60 frames per second at 4K. Now, this is not a huge deal for me. There are a lot of films that I do where I don't even touch 120 frames per second. However, there are some narrative films where I really want to slow a scene down. Maybe I'm trying to get into the character's head or into that moment, elongate that moment so that the audience can really feel what this character is feeling in this moment. So I will slow it down to 120 frames per second to really get that feel I'm looking for. However, for most things like TV commercials and even documentaries, I don't even touch any slow motion at all. It's usually 24 frames per second. Another thing with the new firmware update for the Sony FX3, you do have true 24 frames per second and true 4K. Again, not a huge deal. I very rarely will use this unless a client specifically wants that. That hardly ever happens. I'm usually just using the 23.93 or whatever it is. You absolutely don't need that. You could use the Sony A7IV for a lot of this stuff that I'm talking about, so just keep that in mind. Okay, so let's talk about who these cameras are for. The Sony FX3 is close to $4,000, while the Sony A7IV is closer to $2,500. Definitely something to consider. If you're a cinematographer or videographer and you're looking to upgrade your current system, then the Sony FX3 is an excellent choice. However, if you're just starting out and you want a camera that's gonna work well for you over the course of many years, then the Sony A7IV is a great option. But I actually get a lot of questions on how I use these cameras and what I would do personally if I was investing in one of these. So let's get into how I use these cameras. I personally use my Sony FX3 for these YouTube videos. I'm using the Sony FX3 for this talking head right now. However, I also use it for a lot of my client work, documentaries, TV commercials, and even some narrative films. And if I want to upgrade or need to upgrade my system, then I could just rent it. However, I've also used my Sony A7IV for a handful of projects, and I've always been pleased with the results. You may have heard me say this a lot lately, but it's really not about the camera gear. An upgraded camera can and will make things easier in terms of getting a high quality product, but it's really all about you, the filmmaker, and your knowledge about the craft and what you're doing to get better at it. So whatever camera you use, and as always on this channel, keep learning, keep practicing, and keep making films. The rest will come in due time. Well, that's gonna do it for me, you guys. Thank you so much for joining me in this video. If you like this video or you learned something, please click the like button down below. Consider subscribing if you haven't already, and I'll catch you in the next one. Cheers, friends.